This conference will now be recorded.
Okay. Um, Hi, welcome everyone. I'm David Myers, Executive Director of the Conservation Finance Alliance, and um, together, and I have Sean Nazarelli here, who's with Biofund in Mozambique, and Sean had made the suggestion to maybe get everyone together to talk about the coronavirus and how it's influencing conservation trust funds and our conservation activities in general, as well as thinking about conservation finance and the coronavirus. And from the response here, I would say that's been a pretty good idea, Sean. We have a few partners and friends who are going to talk about it from their perspective. And I just wanted to say that from my perspective, before I pass it over to Sean, I just want to say that this is, um, a global challenge, and it's coming across quite quickly. It's affecting almost all countries, will affect all countries, and it will affect so many different forms of work and um, and socializing and all kinds of aspects of our life. Um, and it's interesting to see um, how the world is responding in many ways, um, not adequately in many ways, and it's reminiscent and it forms very strong parallels, in my opinion, to how the world is not responding to the climate crisis and not responding to the nature crisis in ways that are effective. So, we had plenty of warning that this would happen. We kind of knew how it would play out, but still we were unprepared. And I worry that this is just a precursor, and this is one that has like direct human life implications and human economy implications. And of course, as everyone who's on this call knows, ignoring climate change and not finding a solution will ultimately lead to also massive problems for human well-being and the economy, of course. And the same goes for neglecting our treatment of nature. So um, this is an interesting opportunity to reflect on a lot of these issues um, and reflect on our role in it. And I'm really pleased that we're able to have this discussion. If it seems like a good forum, we'd be more than happy to have it again and talk about issues in more detail. But for now, let me pass it over to Sean, and we're gonna have some presentations from different people, and then we'll be doing so an online discussion. And to participate in that, because this is just a webinar. It's not a, well, it's like a web meeting. It's not a webinar. Everyone can mute and unmute their microphone, but to do the discussion session, I would like everyone just to effectively raise your hand by putting in the messages in the chat that you would like to speak. You have a question. You don't have to tell us what the question is. If you'd like, you could let us know what the topic is, and then Kumar and myself will sort of go through those and call on you to unmute your microphone, and then Sean will sort of handle the discussion online. So that's how that'll go for the discussion part. And right now I'm going to pass it over to Sean. And thanks everyone for joining, and I hope you're all well.
Okay, thanks very much, David, and thanks very much for CFA for helping us facilitate this discussion. Obviously, all of us know that in the conservation finance family and in conservation in general, the COVID-19 pandemic is having impacts across the world on our work, from work on the ground for the actual conservation work, but also at a level for conservation finance. So impacting the way that we're operating as conservation organizations, as conservation finance organizations specifically. And so we thought it would be useful to have a discussion about how this is being responded to by the various CTFs around the world, all of us in different phases of our pandemic, but all of us really facing very similar issues. And then also a little bit of reflection on ways moving forward. What are the silver linings we see in this crisis? What kind of positive, optimistic thoughts for change in the medium longer term do we have? So we're going to have this discussion sort of half and half. First half hour, we'll talk about the challenges and the main problems that conservation finance is particularly facing. And then the second half, we'll look more at those opportunities and the silver linings and the possibilities. So we have 4 people on our panel. We have both the presidents of the CAFE Conservation Trust Fund Network in Africa. We have Karen online here. We are connecting to Zdenka Piskalic from the Costa Rica Por Siempre Fund, who is currently the president for REDLAC, the largest conservation trust fund network in the world. And then we have the perspective of 2 other major donors. We have Thierry here from the MAVA Foundation, and we also have Constance Corbier-Bartot from FFEM. So we're going to ask all of them to give just a few minutes of introductory thoughts on both the negatives, and then again on the positives. But I think before we do that, we've also brought along to set the stage in terms of what's happening with the financial markets. We've asked James Monikaila, who's a consultant who's worked with a lot of different trust funds, including ours here in Mozambique last year, and has presented at several REDLAC meetings over the years. And he's going to set the stage for us a little bit in terms of putting out what's happening in the world of finance and how that might affect us. So James, do you want to have just a few minutes here to start up?
Good morning, everybody, and thank you, Sean, and thank you, David, for the introduction. First off, I'll just assume everybody can hear me okay. David and Sean, just check in if that's all right. Thank you. I'm going to keep my camera off if that's okay. I can give you a quick wave, but my Zoom or this GoToMeeting is saying that the hi everybody. The broadband is struggling a bit, so I just thought I'd do voice only. But really lovely to be here. Okay, this is a meeting for the conservation finance community, and so it just needs me to underline the fact that it's in that order. Conservation is really the topic of this conversation. Finance, the bit I'm going to talk about, follows the conservation story. So I'm grateful that you've given me the slot up front, but it's the money shouldn't be driven, shouldn't drive the mission. The mission needs to be driven by the money. But of course, I've got to start by saying this is unsettling and it's challenging time for everybody. Definitely the coronavirus impact has taken the economic community, economic markets, and given them a big challenge and a big wake-up call. But my overriding comment to you, and the caveat is this is financial advice, these are just my own thoughts, is that you've got to focus on what you can control. And so it's scary when you see headline indices, you know, most global markets are down 20-25% the first quarter of 2020, and it's been a rocky road throughout April. The US has performed slightly better financially in terms of stock markets, and I can touch on that in the Q&A tonight. But volatility is still high universally. So with that context, there's obviously a lot of stuff in the media and in the press around business interruption, around the rise in unemployment, around stretching supply chains, around how the global community, economic community, is going to adapt to the new parameters, I think, post-COVID. And some of that will be dependent upon the economic stimulus packages that each individual country puts in place. But I'm not going to concentrate, and Katie gave me some good headlines, I'm not going to concentrate on the economics per se. I've just basically got 3 simple points I was going to make, and these cut to the heart of really foundations and endowments that have a long time horizon, of which the conservation trust community is part. And this is hopefully not too mum and apple pie stuff, but hopefully might be heartening a bit in these challenging times. It absolutely is about focusing on your strengths. Endowments have gifted assets or fundraised assets for a reason. So they have a balance sheet made up of investments and endowment assets. And that is obviously a great, powerful tool in these uncertain times. The first point I'd say, and it's fairly self-evident, is think about your cash. There's no doubt that many corporates in many sectors will be cutting dividends, payments, discretionary payments that companies make to their shareholders. And that'll have an implication and an impact on the distribution that you receive in terms of income. This is just the return you get, the yield you get on your stock holdings. There'll be pressure obviously on fixed interest, and you can see that in the yields that are coming on in fixed interest as well. So think about the impact of reduced income and plan your cash flow carefully. That's just about sitting down with your finance team and thinking about what's coming in and what's going out of the door, and plan your cash flow carefully. Because the second point I'm going to make is maybe counterintuitive, which is that a lot of foundations and trusts, and I don't think CTFs are different in this community, particularly those with long-term investment horizons and with built-up capital in investments, should seek to maintain spending where you can, and particularly where you have a total return approach. In other words, you're able to take investment returns over a long period of time, 3-5 years, and average those and distribute an annualized amount based on a 5-year average. If you look at the last 5 years in most developed economies, your investments are still up by maybe double digits, 10% most probably over the last 5 years. 2019 was a boost year, absolutely. We've seen, you know, high teens, maybe 20% returns, and 2020 has just flipped it. Of course, there is the I can't spend now because I don't know what the future is going to look like. And again, we can touch on that in the Q&A, what the economists are thinking about what might happen in the next quarter, next 6 months, next year, next 2 years. And in parenthesis, a flag for John Adams. He put out a great paper at the weekend, just giving a perspective from the US about what John sees as the projections out of the current situation. And the last point I'd make for foundations, point number 3, is avoid making any snap decisions. Hasty decisions can be very costly. Think about it in the round. Think about your investment governance in the round, and use the time wisely now to think about how effective is your investment governance. So simple questions you can ask yourself around: when did you last meet your IMC meet? And you can say yesterday or the day before or last week or last month in order to respond to the crisis. When did you last meet face-to-face or online with your manager? And how have they been keeping you up to speed and informed? Are they able to offer you guidance and advice around your portfolio's resilience in the current market? Because a lot of investment professionals will be telling you that not every sector and not every company is suffering in this current crisis. And we'll all be aware of that in our own lives, about how we've had to adapt, use technology in a very different way, use remote working in a different way, use companies and companies' services in a different way. So there will definitely be winners and losers out of this, and that'll be reflected in the movement in value and the movement in price of various companies. So obviously you'll see some sectors are much more resilient. So tech sectors, the pharmacy sector are going to be much more resilient perhaps than conventional sectors like finance and banking. So I would urge you to use the time to reflect on your governance, your investment governance. And it might seem like a truism, and again, a flag out for the review that David and Katie and others are doing. Think about aligning your investment with your mission. And this is going beyond the core stuff of negative and positive screening, but really trying to make sure that your investment philosophy and practice is really aligned with your activity, and that you're using every opportunity to make sure that you hold resilient and robust and aligned assets in your main investment portfolio. You're not just making money in one hand and spending it on the other. So I'm going to end by saying, hold your nerve if you can. Everybody's situation will be different. Everybody's endowment will be different. The size of their investable assets will be different. But the principles are there. And I'm very happy to answer any Q&A during the call now or at the end as you want. I'll stay on for the hour. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks a lot, James. That's a useful bit of reality, perhaps, to hold our nerve. It's not always easy to do in times of crisis. But let's call in our panelist. I think Zdenke is now in the meeting. Yes, Zdenke?
Yes, I'm here. Good morning.
Good morning, or good evening in our case. But since you, as head of REDLAC, I think you know the scene we've set here. As head of REDLAC, let's talk a little bit about the unique challenges that you see conservation trust funds facing in this crisis, just for a couple of minutes.
Yes, thank you. I think conservation trust funds are facing both internal and external challenges, many of them related to sustainability, as we just heard. Internally, many of us obviously continue to have expenses that without having full capacity for our operations. And this is something we also have to contemplate. Many of our fundraising campaigns have been postponed. There is an increase in the workload for many of the leaderships, and in many cases, an incapacity to comply with some of the current commitments with funders. Externally, many of our programmed events have been canceled, as you all well know, and this was supposed to be the international year of the super year of biodiversity, and many of us had invested greatly in preparing for this year and for what the implications of being able to do fundraising and advance in conservation goals. And obviously many of these events have been canceled, as well as a lot of the field work that we do. Another impact has been the work with government. As you know, governments, of course, have shifted their priorities, and many of our ongoing agreements and a lot of the work that we do as conservation trust funds is political. Many of these agreements are now paralyzed or just being postponed for obvious reasons. I think another big emerging threat is the environmental threat to the work that we do, both caused by some of the illegal activities that we are starting to see. Obviously, in countries, for example, in Costa Rica, that are so highly dependent on tourism, as is the case in many of the countries in Africa and many other countries in Latin America, with our borders closed, unemployment is increasing rapidly, and there is a need. Many of our conservation trust funds have focused our alternative livelihood strategies on promoting tourism in many of these areas, and now this is something that is not being done, and so it's obviously having an impact directly on the communities where we are working and in the livelihoods of the communities where we are doing our work. So there's new emergent environmental threats, including illegal activities that require more control and surveillance in and around the protected areas where we work. In some countries, we have also learned that there's an increased threats for environmental defenders. So this is something also to take into account in many of these areas. And in general, we feel that there is a bigger need to support our partners who are suffering from the impact in their livelihoods, and to rethink and reshift the way in which we do fundraising. On a positive side, I think that the fact that many conservation trust funds are prepared for the long term. This is really a moment when we can come out and use this to find and seek new opportunities to support. For example, here in Costa Rica with the Forever Costa Rica Trust, today we launched a special call for proposals to support livelihoods within the community where we work based on the impacts, direct impacts of COVID. And so many of the conservation trust funds, because they do have this sustainability component, actually have the capacity to make a difference, whereas many of the local organizations, smaller organizations, are going more, are feeling more of the crisis because of their short-term administrative capacity. So there is an opportunity for trust funds to jump in and help breach this gap. But at the same time, we are seeing obviously internal and external pressures caused by this pandemic.
Thanks a lot for that, Stenka. I think you mentioned a number of some of the key problems a number of us are facing. To get a little bit of perspective from the other side of the world and some of the younger trust funds, Karen, do you want to talk a little bit about some of the cafe members, less well established, perhaps less able to take advantage of these new opportunities that Stenka was talking about? Or do you think that that's also valid for the cafe network?
Hello, Sean, can you hear me? Thumbs up. Okay, great. So thank you so much to Sean and David for organizing this very timely and relevant topic as we embark on this journey to manage the pandemic. I think as a country, what I can say is I think we've been one of the last countries to actually, confirm cases, and we're really at the beginning of seeing how this will pan out for us, at a national level. Many thanks to Zenka as well for her very valid contributions, which I think many of them are relevant even within the conservation work that we do as African Conservation Trust Funds. I think it is an emergency, and to a large extent, even as African Conservation Trust Funds, it's something that we can say we were not prepared for financially. I think as a trust fund, especially in Malawi, we're not sitting here with a reserve budget that can deal with this, an emergency budget, I should say. And in addition to that, we've got no operating guidelines. We're kind of having to figure things out as we move along, in line with obviously what the international community is informing us and what the national government is informing us. Specifically, as a country, we are not currently on any kind of lockdown, so our protected areas are open. Although what I can see, as Zenka has already mentioned, the decline in the number of tourists that are coming through, that will be coming through in the short to medium term. And that would have an impact, especially where there's revenue generation for surrounding communities. This will have an impact because what we are seeing is the pandemic, the crisis that we're in, really taking its toll socially. I think the social perspective is very valid, and we will see how that dynamic will pan out in terms of the pressure it will add to the natural resource base. And the reason why I say this is because in many countries within Africa, there has been some resistance to how we manage it, whether countries should go through the lockdown. And the lockdown, there has been some resistance, especially in Malawi, because most of the population lives on a hand-to-mouth, day-to-day basis. So the priority for most communities and individuals and poor and vulnerable households is the need to access food. So we may see obviously issues around natural resource management taking a bit of a backbencher, but conservation trust funds obviously play a role in trying to put the conservation agenda forward as best way as they can. But what we can see at the moment could be strategies being put in place that can support livelihoods of communities, additional support around protected areas for communities to be able to get through the crisis. As a trust fund, we have, as Zenka has also said, we have reduced our field presence. So our field work has significantly gone down. We still work with partners in various areas, both inside and outside of protected areas. However, obviously the concerns around how they should adjust their modalities to work still remain. As an institution, unfortunately, we've also had to postpone issues around recruitment. This is recruitment of staff, both internally. We also work with volunteers, we work with interns. And I know that other conservation trust funds also work with possibly research scientists collecting data in the field. And this potentially has had an impact on the timeline of when that can happen. So contributing to, sort of like capacity building and environmental education type initiatives that we've had to suspend. I think looking at, just in addition to what Zenka already mentioned, looking at agreements that we have with donors and partners is the need to revisit those and revisit the risk analysis around the projects that we're supporting in light of this crisis. And I think that is something new that will be that will have to be done in light of the ongoing agreements, and to see how those timelines will be affected by the pandemic. I think generally we've seen issues around social distancing, which in some instances has not been working well on the continent. It is quite foreign, and while that is not within the realm of conservation trust funds per se, but it potentially could have an impact. And finally, I think it's just to add that, yeah, I think as Zenka has already mentioned, we've seen the postponement of a number of international meetings of significance, not only for the national governments, but also for the work that we do. This is looking at international meetings around the CBD and also the climate change conference. We know that IUCN has also postponed theirs, and similarly, that has an impact on events that we planned both as CAFE and REDLAC in terms of our annual assemblies. So we're looking at an opportunity to see how conservation trust funds can do more virtually through access to conferencing technologies, although we are mindful that this cannot replace the networking and interactions that happen in person. But I think there is an opportunity to see how we can work and relate and continue to do what we need to do using technology and other means, innovative means that are available to us.
Thanks, Karen, for that. Let's move across to get the idea. Both you and Zdenka talked a little bit about the challenges of having commitments existing donors that need to be rescheduled and reorganized. Maybe I'll ask Constance Corbier-Bartheu from FFEM to come in here and see a little bit about how are you reorganizing your programs around the world. You have hundreds of programs now being funded. Have you made a systematic alteration to them, or is it being done on an ad hoc basis? Constance?
Yeah, thank you. Good afternoon, good morning, good night, everybody. Can you hear me? Yeah, it's okay. Yes, well, I think this time is essentially a time of uncertainty, and uncertainty for everybody at each level. So at individual level, at country level, and at organization level, uncertainty is rather dealt on a case-by-case and day-to-day approach rather than through a systematic and too global approach. So definitely we will learn from this crisis, and we don't know a lot about this such a crisis. What I wanted just to stress is that FFM is devoted, as you know, to conservation linked to development, and of course all the threats that Zdenka has listed on environment that are supposed to be increased through this crisis are a big issue for FFM, and we are looking case by case on all the projects we are supporting to make sure that first the communities involved and the remote places where we cannot go and where we have not necessarily all the information coming up from these remote places are covered by the crisis. I mean, special attention is given today to the NGOs working in some places. Very difficult to get some information from there. Then on the positive things, I think time is there for capitalization, definitely, for exchanging, for solidarity, for new ways and creativity of new ways to communicate and to exchange. And definitely the two networks with whom we are working, Red Laken Cafe, and also the CFA as a platform of actors, are places where we are expecting a lot about these new ways of still keeping the link and taking stock of what happens on the day-to-day basis, and also spreading out and making known where we have things to share, and how can we share in order to be at the same level of information. But then I don't want to keep the floor too much, because I see you are so numerous. I'm happy to be part of this big community of brainstorming that I prefer to listen rather to speak. So thank you very much, and I'm still listening to you.
Thanks, Constance. I think we also want to listen. I encourage everyone who is listening and who wants to make a contribution about some way in which their fund is responding to this crisis in a creative way. I think that's a great, and you'd like to share it, please do let us know in the comment section, and we'll call on you shortly. We're going to give a few minutes left to Thierry from the MAVA Foundation, also to talk a little bit from a central funding perspective on a few of the opportunities looking forward. And we'd really like to focus the discussion then on what positive things can we see coming out of this current crisis. All right, Constance mentioned one or two. Thierry, I'm not sure if you have some suggestions for us as well. Thierry, are you online still?
Thierry, it looks like your microphone is unmuted, but we can't hear you, unfortunately.
Can you?
Yes, you're coming in now.
Oh, it's okay. Okay.
It's a little choppy, but good. Yeah.
Okay. So just make sign if that's not working well enough. So I think I don't want to repeat things. As foundation, we are all figuring out what the situation means, and you can see that nobody knows what it means. We see immediate impact, but we do not understand the long-term impact. Our partners, civil society, have no clue how the future will look like. And we do what we can to help them. The good news is that conservation trust funds are seen by MAVA, at least, as the most resilient organizations and partner compared to other civil society organizations. So I think it's very interesting to discuss that. I mean, to keep that in mind. Now that with this uncertainty, it's very likely that funding will be diminished for nature conservation, and I think that brings a new light on conservation finance mechanism and on conservation finance strategies that are diversified enough, not only for conservation trust funds, but for all conservation projects that you can work with. In this part, of course, there is a role for foundations there. So I will have just 3 points. One is, as foundations, we have a pressure to step up, to kind of increase investment, fill the gap, but also give more flexibility to our partners. And I think that's something that can easily apply to conservation trust funds. It might be counterintuitive, but in time of crisis, increasing the amount you give away to your usual partner might be very, very important. Even if that might mean decreasing your endowment, that could be the time to do that. Also giving your recipient more flexibility, considering if there are cases where you can go to unrestricted funding, can also be very helpful to increase the impact. So that's a way to answer to challenges, but also to show how, as foundation or as a conservation trust fund, you can really be part of the solution. The second one is also specific for conservation trust fund. Money for biodiversity will be scarce. There will be competition. So conservation trust funds need to make a case that they are good investments. Conservation trust funds are often seen as good tool when for resilience. So that's the time when we should be able to show that. So as long as you go during this crisis, if you can build evidence of that, if you can monitor what's happening and how you respond to the crisis, then you will build your case for future investment. And I think that that's very important, especially because this discussion, when I have $1 million, shall I invest it in a project or in an endowment? That discussion will be relaunched. And when there is a crisis, donors go for immediate impact on the ground and are less keen to contribute to endowment or sinking fund. So that's there is a strong case to document what's happening and to build evidence that conservation trust funds can be a solution. And my third point is about the conservation finance community in general. I mean, we see that there is an opportunity. We see that there will be huge amounts spent for relaunching the economy. We need to make sure that this economy is going in the right direction, and as much as we can integrate green stuff into these economic plans, be it even biodiversity into that. The challenge I see is that I feel that the conservation finance was waiting for this opportunity to impact development plans, and that now that there is the opportunity and the door is open, we do not really know what to do and where to approach this. So I think that's maybe something to reflect on, is how can we really seize the opportunity of all this money that goes to the economic development of our countries.
Okay, thanks, Thierry. I think we have a few questions now. We're going to open the floor up to everyone here listening for their own contributions and ideas on how perhaps we can be more active in that, impacting development plans or making sure that the recovery investment is going into green investments. I understand Melissa Moy from WWF US has a few comments and contributions she'd like to make. Can we pass the mic over to Melissa?
Hi, everybody. Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you well.
Okay, great. So I just wanted to highlight a few things based on what I'm hearing from around WWF and also from partners. And I think, what Thierry just said about the links between economic recovery packages and, the potential greening of these packages. There has been a lot of attention to that being paid around WWF, different offices talking about it. Sadly, in my own country, the United States, it's not going in a positive direction for obvious reasons. But in other countries, there is potential. But to me, one of the big questions is, can we also green foreign aid? And in this respect, I'm hearing more chatter around debt relief and debt swaps than I have, than I have in a long time, quite honestly. So it's interesting to look at what is going to happen with some of this debt relief, not necessarily through swaps, but through any conditionality that may be attached to it. Another topic I wanted to raise is the whole question of illegal wildlife trade, which affects, places all over the world, but particularly Africa, and then on the, Asia. And of course, everyone knows that, why did this COVID crisis happen? Well, it was directly linked to illegal wildlife trade. And so, organizations who've been advocating for closing down wet markets, the links between deforestation and, health or pandemics, which are not over, which, this can happen again. And so I think it's really important that the conservation community plays an appropriate role in bringing this attention. And then finally, I think from a kind of a policy point of view, the question of vulnerable populations, indigenous people, but also small businesses. I think everyone referred to the question of tourism. I will say from previous crises, what people have documented is that the tourism sector actually comes back faster than many other sectors. But of course, we don't know what's going to happen with this crisis, but I do think it's important to support small businesses. I see that happening here, but I also think looking at what sort of emergency support can be provided to keep businesses going. And then, of course, as I mentioned, indigenous peoples who are more vulnerable to the impacts of health issues related to COVID. How can special attention be paid for that? And then finally, just one last thing. One thing that has really inspired me is to see that some of the initiatives that we're supporting are actually working harder and not letting this crisis interfere with what they're trying to do. And I really think that now that we've gotten not quite used to this new situation, but at least are adapting to it, persevering. And then I suppose one last thing I would say is just on the fundraising development side, the picture is mixed, honestly. What we're hearing from our fundraising people is that there are certain donors who are stepping up more as a result of this crisis. And so I do think that we're not quite sure. It depends to some extent how the markets come back. And sometimes we find that individual donors actually step up more when they see governments stepping back. So let's hope that that phenomena continues. Thanks, everybody.
Great, thanks very much for those thoughts, Melissa. I think, yeah, you've started to touch on some of those silver linings, trying to use this crisis to decrease the illegal wildlife trade, and making that link between deforestation and health is certainly a much stronger argument now than it was this time last year, and is certainly something to be used in communication. I think it's interesting to bring up the idea of debt relief. It's something we are seeing being talked about again. So maybe debt swaps are once again on the table for countries around the world to start looking at opportunities. Have we got a few more comments coming in?
Yeah, Sean, let's maybe open it up to some questions. So I'm going to call on some people. Camilla will be the first, and then after Camilla, we'll have a quick message from Johan, and then from Andrew Schatz. So Camilla, over to you. So try to keep it relatively short so we could have more of so we can start sort of a discussion type thing going here, if you can. But
yeah.
Yeah.
No, actually, my comment was a question. I wanted to hear from the audience about opportunities and I think Melissa answered my question already with some thoughts. So I don't really need to comment, but my question was, what are the opportunities? How to combine the economic recovery activities and build some nice programs where we can combine with building resilience of communities and of ecosystems with economic recovery. Yeah.
Yeah, great. Hey, Johan, did you want to unmute yourself and ask a question?
Yeah, hi everybody.
Share,
Maybe
share
just
the
a short comment. Can you hear me, David?
We hear you.
Cool. So just quickly, we are NGO based in Southern Africa and largely dependent on tourism income to fund the biodiversity work and community projects that we run. And obviously tourism was one of the first industries to be affected, and we felt it immediately. So even if you had a good financial practices with 2 months worth of operating capital, that capital is now gone. And you have now got to figure out how you're going to plug those holes. And those holes include the corporates that used to support us, many of them in the tourist sector that are in dire straits, and the short to long-term prospects of them supporting us are also a reality that we have to face with. In the short run, we've had great response from individuals, supporters who have stepped up and made donations. But in the long run, we are still skeptical about when tourism will be able to fill the funding gap that we've come to rely on. So we've seen from cancellations and people willing to rebook, and when they do that, we can't see that people returning to South Africa, especially within the next 9 months. And so the other question is, how long do we hold our breaths for? What type of money do we try and borrow or try and get for our organization to survive? And does it need to survive for 6 months? Probably more than that. So we're working on 9, but having the reality that we have to probably survive for 12 without that income, and that's a big concern. Then in terms of the opportunities, obviously we have to pivot our efforts, what we as an NGO do within the global community funding sector, and a lot of that will go towards education around COVID, how to flatten the curve, how to stay healthy, all those type of things. So that's an opportunity that we see with our community-based programs. But again, it does somehow or can deflect some of our cooperations and our long-term strategies. But short-term survival, we'll have to look at those type of opportunities, as it were. And yeah, but in the short, it is very scary, and it's not an easy prospect to look at. Thanks, guys.
Good luck managing that. And just one thought before moving on to Andrew, just that we in conservation finance rely a lot on tourism as a source of revenue, to complement other government sources, and it's one of the main sort of site-based revenue streams. And we keep suggesting to all organizations that they should have a diversified portfolio of revenue streams. And so this is an extreme example of how tourism revenue needs to either go into a trust fund that can balance it out, or be complemented with a diversity of other revenue streams for protected areas. So quickly over to Andrew, and then Jacob. And we have please note, everyone, on the chat box, there's a note from Jean Brown with a survey from IUCN for impact of COVID on protected areas. Andrew,
thank you, David. Very briefly, I guess I'm curious to get others' thoughts here as to how we in the conservation finance community can best combat the illegal wildlife trade and dangerous wildlife practices. When it comes to the typical tools that we use to combat illegal wildlife trade, it's oftentimes law and policy reform as well as enforcement efforts to crack down on criminals. And then when it's
when you're addressing dangerous wildlife practices, I think that the tools that we use, whether it's endowments or other sort of financial incentives, it seems like that strikes me as a more natural fit, where we're combating things like habitat destruction and deforestation, and supporting a healthier interaction with the natural environment. But I'm curious as to that first category, whether there is, whether we see opportunities to support better enforcement. Yeah, just throwing that out there.
Great, thanks, Andrew. I think it's a lot of people. It's one of the sort of articles I think I've seen more that people are talking about that, and it could be the one positive thing that comes out of this. Hopefully there'll be more. There's another question from Jacob here about how can we use this as an opportunity to leverage more funding? Jacob, did you want to unmute yourself, and then afterwards Jean maybe, and then Denise.
Thanks, David. I don't have much to add outside of what I've already written into the chat, but it just seems to me that we know that certain diseases are inextricably linked to climate change.
Well, I've lost your signal.
David, anyone?
Yeah, so we've lost your signal, I guess Sean's saying. Coming in and out.
I think we've lost you, Jacob, but I think everyone can read your comment. Jean's talked about the Protect Area Survey, and I think that's a great thing for as many people involved in tourism as possible to be involved in. We have actually heard some news is coming from the conservation community on the positive impact of this in terms of tourism in places where that tourism is a threat to biodiversity. So we've seen some things out of certain marine protected areas where the lack of tourism is in fact a good thing for some of our biodiversity. We had one more comment here, I think, from Denise going back to the same issue about communication and how to mobilize our communications people. Denise, do you want to follow up on that a bit?
Yes, thank you. No, it's exactly what I wrote here. My question is, do we have communication people on board in this meeting? Or we need to find a way to capitalize what we're saying here and turn it into a quick action point from the CTFs or the conservation community to this COVID-19. That's my comment. Thank you. I think there are great stories here, great opportunities to build these case studies in a very easy way that people can understand, but also capitalize each country perspective. So it will be good to share the meeting notes with the communication team, or if we have communication people here, they should be paying attention to those quick and nice messages that have been said here already.
Yeah, great, thanks. Yeah, often these meetings are attended by the CEOs and not necessarily by the communications people. So making sure that we get those messages and cross them, and those who are working on those messages in the big NGOs, sharing those messages, making sure they're coordinated. That's a really good way to move forward, and perhaps something the networks can say. Now we seem to have, I think, about 4 minutes left. Do we want to wrap back to our original two heads of those CTF networks and give you a few minutes of positive thinking for the future, medium long-term positive goals you might think about? I mean, we talked about the closing of wildlife markets in China. That's great. We've seen a drastic pollution drop across all the industrialized nations, showing it's possible to really halt climate change. And many of those big changes that people have talked about that, oh, we could never stop the economy because it's just too important. have in fact been recognized as lies, and in fact we can stop the economy when it's important enough. So are these advantages we can take advantage of in the future to save the planet as well? Zdenka, a few thoughts on a philosophical tone.
Oh, thank you. I do think that there is a silver lining to everything that is happening. Just hearing some of you talk about tourism, for example, I've been reading a lot about the future of tourism, where most tourism is actually going to be focused on visiting natural areas, open areas where social distancing is possible. Changing the model of tourism from massive, all-inclusive tourism to actual time in protected areas. So this is actually a good opportunity, I think, in the long term, as Melissa mentioned. I think that we are also showing that many of the conservation trust funds and the conservation trust fund community is resilient. And that's really what we are all about. It's about being able to maintain our head above water, even in these dire conditions, and showing that we have been prepared also to overcome some of these issues in the long term. And I think it speaks well for the conservation community. And I think to the last point about communication, for example, we're starting a campaign called United and Resilient. And part of that campaign is really demonstrating how our work is geared towards strengthening the livelihoods of many of these communities that are now being impacted. And so I think there is a huge possibility in the future also with fundraising to really focus on the livelihoods, and not only on the conservation piece, but also on the livelihoods that accompanies this piece. So I think we're in the door of a new opportunity, and hopefully this will inspire many others who are now seeing the connectivity, how closely we are connected in this world, to understand that the decisions that are made on one side of the world impacts everyone. And hopefully this will lead to a change in mentality as well.
Thanks. A few last words from you, Karen?
Yeah, thank you so much. I think this is really the first of many conversations that we can have on this topic. And I'm really thankful to everybody that signed in to be part of this, and the comments and the questions that we've received through the chat. So it's really thought-provoking, and I think for the continent and the globe, obviously our world is changing, and we need to think through whether this is going to be our new norm for a while to come. But having said that, and it's been repeated quite a few times this afternoon or this morning, depending on where you are, is that CTFs have proven to have a deep sense of resilience, and this is where we need to change gears in terms of being able to evolve and to respond to the new challenges that are being presented to us. So I think there are many opportunities, and we do need to focus on the silver lining that is out there. We will be initiating and continuing to have this conversation with the African CTFs, so that we can document the experiences that are coming out of Africa, especially since maybe we've been, towards the end of joining this crisis. However, a few countries are already a month, ahead of us already. So I take Denise's comment to heart in terms of how do we really, document this and present it as in terms of how the continent is coping and what the way forward would look like for CTFs in Africa, and how that relates to the experiences of our partner networks such as REDLAC and other NGOs that are struggling in conservation throughout the world. So as we continue to embrace the changes that are taking place around us, it's really to look forward to the opportunities and to look out for the opportunities that will come out of this.
Thanks, Karen. I think that's a great sort of wrap up. I think David's going to cut me off in a second anyway, but I guess we should just do a little shout out here at the end to all those funders. So obviously it's a great idea to double down on your CTF investments, and it's a great time to do that, because when the market's down, of course, your investments will then take advantage of the rebound, and perhaps the CTFs are uniquely poised to take advantage of that by investing in exactly those green areas of the economy and to make a difference with their investments as well as their actual programmatic efforts on the ground. I did actually, just this conversation is a long one. There are a lot of issues we've touched on today and a lot more we didn't even get to. I was hoping I'd provoke Zdenka in her last comment to talk a little bit about the ideas that REDLAC have of hosting a potential virtual Congress on this issue a little bit later on in the year. Zdenka, do you want to talk about that, or should we put that off for a while?
Yes, no, definitely. So there is an initiative to join forces, the CTF community, and put together a virtual Congress this year in lieu of the normal REDLAC Congress that is celebrated every year, to actually have a joint Congress, REDLAC and CAFE, with a supportive and partnership with CFA, and be able to provoke these discussions in an online conference. So this would be our first online REDLAC CAFE Congress to happen this year, later in this year. And so stay tuned. We will be giving you more details on this in the upcoming month. But this is really an opportunity to learn from each other, to give us a few more months to understand how our situations have evolved, and to be able to share lessons learned and opportunities, both in finance, investment, in the work that we're doing with our partners, and new trends that are happening in terms of fundraising, how fundraisers and donors have reacted to this situation, and what the future holds for us. So we hope you can all join us for this Congress. We will be hashing out the details in the upcoming 2 weeks, and then hopefully send an invitation to all of you.
Excellent. Well, I just want to, I think we need to close off here because we're about 4 minutes over. I'm sure everyone's got other engagements, but just wanted to thank Sean especially for instigating this idea. I think it's proven to be something that everyone's interested in, and we obviously are just starting out this discussion. And one possibility is also maybe to do this somewhat regularly, maybe to check in another, say, 3 weeks or a month. If that's something that's sounds interesting, let us know somehow. Send an email, I think that there's so much to discuss, and we're just sort of touching the surface here, and thrilled that this virtual conference can be organized later in the year, and wishing you all safety and well-being and sanity, and everything positive going forward. Thanks again to all the panelists, and to all the participants. And on that, we'll sign off and stay well.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks, bye.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thanks to all of you.
Thanks. Bye, Dave.
Bye, be safe.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, Sean. Well done. Cheers.